Hashtag the initial tension and the better than you barrage. The annual Henderson family gathering was in full, boisterous swing. The air in my parents' spacious dining room was thick with the scent of roasted turkey, mulled cider, and the familiar, slightly suffocating pressure of familial expectation. For me, Alex, the narrator, this event was always a complicated mixture of comfort and low-grade anxiety, mostly thanks to my older sister, Captain Sarah Henderson. I had just finished a mild-mannered conversation with Aunt Carol about my current freelance work, designing the branding and web presence for a sustainable startup, when Sarah smoothly glided into our cluster. She looked, as always, immaculate, even in her civilian attire, a sharply tailored navy blazer and perfectly pressed slacks. She projected an unmistakable aura of command and unwavering discipline. Sarah was a career officer in the U.S. Navy, a logistics specialist with several high-profile deployments under her belt, and she never let anyone forget the weight and gravity of her profession. She was, in the family's eyes and emphatically in her own, the golden standard. "Oh, still talking about your little artistic endeavors, Alex?" Sarah interjected, her smile polite but her eyes holding a familiar, razor-sharp condescension. She didn't wait for an answer, instead turning to Aunt Carol with a knowing sigh. "Alex is a creative consultant now, Auntie. Means they spend their days deciding which shade of turquoise best conveys eco-friendly and arguing with clients about font choices." The casual dismissal in her tone felt like a physical shove. I bristled slightly but tried to maintain my composure. "It's graphic design and strategy, Sarah. It involves a lot more than picking colors. It's about communication, market placement, and solving complex visual problems." Sarah let out a small, sharp laugh, the kind that signals superiority, not amusement. "Please, Alex. Complex visual problems. I'm currently managing the material readiness of a billion-dollar naval asset, ensuring that over 300 sailors have the supplies they need to execute their mission in a volatile international zone. That is solving complex problems. What you do is nice." She drew out the word nice, as if it were synonymous with trivial or easily dispensable. Aunt Carol, sensing the brewing sibling rivalry, shifted uncomfortably, but Sarah was on a roll, fueled by years of perceiving her military service as a definitive moral and professional high ground. "Honestly, the difference is just staggering," she continued, her voice rising slightly to capture the attention of Dad, who was nearby pouring wine. "My career is essential. It's disciplined, vital to national security, and requires a commitment that few civilians ever grasp. We work with life-and-death consequences. We face actual danger." She paused, making sure everyone within earshot was listening. "And you, Alex? You get stressed because a client demanded a revision on a logo sketch. It's truly difficult to compare the two, isn't it? One is duty. The other is, well, it's a hobby that pays the bills." The phrase "hobby that pays the bills" stung more than any direct insult. It invalidated the late nights, the strategic thinking, and the very real financial pressures of building a self-sustaining creative career. The worst part was the way she framed it, not as a comparison of jobs, but as a comparison of people. Her implied message was clear. I lacked the serious character, the moral fortitude, and the true grit that her real service demanded. I took a deep breath, fighting the urge to lash out. "My work supports local economies, Sarah. It helps small businesses launch and grow, creating jobs and opportunity. Not everything important needs to wear a uniform." She simply smiled that condescending smile again. "Oh, bless your heart, Alex. Always the idealist. Look, I'm not saying your contribution isn't sweet. Just that when the chips are down, when things get truly ugly, my job is the one that matters. Yours is what people do when they have the luxury of time and disposable income. It's the filler between the real action." The conversation had now devolved into a one-sided public shaming session. My parents had drifted closer, their expressions a mixture of pride in Sarah and awkward pity for me. I felt my ears growing hot, the familiar, suffocating cloak of humiliation settling over me. I wanted to disappear. Sarah, having successfully established her dominance and reasserted the narrative of her moral and professional superiority, took a victorious sip of water. She had, in her mind, won the engagement. I simply nodded weakly, unable to form a coherent, dignified rebuttal, choosing silence over prolonging the public spectacle. I mentally retreated, counting the minutes until I could politely leave the gathering, while Sarah basked in the admiring glances and hushed whispers about her true heroism. #, the faltering defense and the sting of humiliation. Sarah's condescending remarks had effectively carved out a space of uncomfortable silence around our small group. Her laughter, sharp and dismissive, had drawn further attention, making the exchange a public spectacle rather than a private squabble. I felt every eye on me, and the pity in some of those gazes was almost worse than Sarah's contempt. I tried one last, desperate attempt to articulate the value of my work, to pull myself out of the hole she had dug for me. "It's not a hobby, Sarah," I started, my voice tight, struggling to keep it from cracking with frustration. "My clients aren't asking for doodles. They're investing thousands of dollars because they need a clear, professional visual identity to stand out in a brutal market. I'm responsible for entire campaign aesthetics, from conception to final execution. That involves project management, stakeholder negotiations, budgeting, and delivering under immense time pressure. It's a specialized skill set, not something anyone can just pick up." My defense, however earnest, fell flat against the armored facade of Sarah's military pride. She didn't even bother to listen fully, cutting me off with a wave of her hand that suggested I was whining. "Oh, the pressure of deadlines," she mocked, leaning conspiratorially toward my Aunt Carol. "Imagine that, Auntie." While I was coordinating medevac routes under threat of enemy fire last spring, Alex was apparently under immense time pressure, trying to decide if the corporate font should be sans serif or slab serif. She then turned back to me, her expression hardening with what she clearly believed was an undeniable truth. "It just doesn't compare, Alex. You deal with preferences. I deal with consequences. Your stakes are a slightly unhappy client. My stakes are human lives and mission failure." The comparison was brutal and utterly dismissive of the complexity I had just tried to explain. It wasn't just about the type of work. It was about the moral weight she assigned to each career. By her measure, any job that didn't involve physical danger or direct national service was inherently inferior, lacking true substance or honor. "Imagine," she continued, pushing her advantage, "while I was on a ship for 6 months with no contact, navigating complex international waters, you were stressed out because your internet connection lagged during a Zoom meeting. The struggle is just so different." Her tone dripped with sarcasm. "The only thing you're fighting is writer's block or the constraints of Adobe Creative Suite." Her words were designed not just to point out differences, but to inflict maximum humiliation. She was skillfully using the respect the family held for her service as a weapon against my non-traditional path. I could feel the flush of embarrassment creeping up my neck. I looked around the room. Dad was giving Sarah a subtle, warning look, but he didn't intervene directly. Mom was busy fussing with the appetizer tray, visibly trying to pretend the conversation wasn't happening. My cousins avoided my gaze, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge the decorated officer in their midst. The feeling was one of profound isolation. I had spent years working hard, building a clientele, and making a name for myself in a highly competitive field. Yet, in this setting, under the glare of Sarah's uniform-sanctioned authority, all that effort evaporated. I was reduced to a frivolous, self-indulgent artist whose contribution was negligible. I opened my mouth, ready to point out that even the military relies heavily on graphic designers for everything from training manuals to propaganda, but the words caught in my throat. What was the use? She wouldn't hear me. She had already decided that her narrative, the noble soldier versus the trivial civilian, was the only one that mattered. A deep wave of weariness washed over me. I realized that Sarah didn't want a discussion. She wanted submission. She wanted me to acknowledge, publicly, that my life choices were less valuable than hers. The sheer weight of her arrogance and the family's implicit agreement was too much to fight in that moment. My shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly. I closed my mouth, giving up the fight. "You're right, Sarah," I muttered. forcing a non-committal tone, choosing surrender just to make the ordeal stop. It's certainly different. Sarah beamed, mistaking my exhausted capitulation for genuine agreement. She had achieved her objective. She then launched into a detailed, self-aggrandizing anecdote about a recent commendation she received, firmly securing the spotlight and leaving me standing there, silent, defeated, and profoundly humiliated. I spent the next few minutes desperately plotting my earliest possible escape, counting down the seconds until the end of the evening, feeling the burning sting of every dismissive word Sarah had uttered. The family gathering, meant to be a place of warmth, had become an arena where I had been thoroughly outmatched and publicly shamed by my own sister. ## the unexpected arrival and the shift in atmosphere. The air in the dining room remained thick with the aftermath of Sarah's victory lap. She was still holding court near the fireplace, regaling a captivated group of cousins and uncles with tales of strategic maneuvers and the solemn responsibility of command. I had managed to discreetly move to the farthest corner of the room, pretending to be utterly engrossed in examining a framed family photo from the early 90s, silently nursing the deep burn of public dismissal. I just needed another 15 minutes of anonymity before I could reasonably say my goodbyes. Suddenly, the smooth, low hum of conversation that usually permeated the gathering abruptly ceased. It was a subtle but profound collective hush, the kind that signals a significant, unexpected event. Ding-dong. The sound of the doorbell, crisp and commanding, cut through the quiet. Everyone paused, eyes instinctively turning towards the front foyer. My parents exchanged a swift, knowing glance that puzzled me. They weren't expecting anyone else. My father, ever the gracious host, set down his empty glass and strode toward the entrance. A moment later, the front door swung open, and the atmosphere inside the house underwent a seismic shift. Standing in the doorway, framed by the warm glow of the porch light, was a man who commanded immediate, unspoken respect. He was tall, impeccably groomed, and, most notably, he was in uniform. Not the simple workaday uniform you might see on base, but the formal dress blues. A striking display of polished brass, crisp fabric, and an array of colorful ribbons and badges that spoke volumes of a distinguished career. On his shoulders rested the insignia of a colonel. The man stepped inside, offering a brief, courteous nod to my father. "Mr. Henderson, thank you for having me. I apologize for the brief notice. I was passing through the area this evening and couldn't miss the opportunity to offer a quick personal greeting." My father beamed, extending his hand. "Colonel Thompson, it is truly an honor. Come in, come in. The family is all here." The name Colonel Thompson seemed to travel through the room like an electric current. For most of the family, he was simply a very high-ranking military officer, an impressive, if intimidating, guest. But for Sarah, the impact was immediate and visceral. Sarah, who moments before was lounging comfortably, leaning against the mantel and effortlessly dominating the room, instantly froze. Her eyes widened, losing their confident spark and filling instead with a mixture of shock and sheer panic. The casual, relaxed posture she had adopted for her civilian setting snapped instantly into the rigid, almost painfully straight spine of a subordinate officer confronted by a superior. It was a transformation so swift and complete it was almost comical, had the situation not been so charged. As Colonel Thompson made his way a few steps into the room, scanning the faces, Sarah pushed herself off the mantel with unnatural speed, coming to a full, stiff attention. Her face, minutes ago flushed with the pleasure of her own superiority, was now strikingly pale. The colonel's eyes finally landed on her. Sarah, the confident, mocking captain, suddenly looked like a nervous cadet. "Captain Henderson," Colonel Thompson stated, his voice deep, measured, and resonating with the unquestionable authority of his rank. Sarah's response was immediate, clipped, and completely devoid of her usual familial swagger. Her voice was barely above a whisper, tight with barely controlled tension. "Sir." "Good evening, sir," she responded, executing a slight, almost involuntary inclination of her head that was part deference, part instinct. The contrast between the Captain Sarah, who had just been ridiculing my career with casual cruelty, and the Officer Sarah now standing rigid and pale before her commander, was stark. The energy in the room, which had been hostile and embarrassing for me, was now simply thick with awe and palpable tension directed entirely at the newly arrived colonel and his subordinate. All eyes, which had recently judged me, were now riveted on the dramatic shift in my sister's demeanor. I watched from my corner, a strange sense of quiet anticipation replacing the earlier misery. The arrival of Colonel Thompson had not only interrupted Sarah's reign of professional superiority, but had completely neutralized her power over the room. The stage was set, and the focus was no longer on my supposed failure, but on Sarah's sudden, nerve-wracking deference to a far greater authority. My mother finally emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a cloth, a small, knowing smirk playing on her lips, a hint that perhaps this unexpected visit was not quite so accidental after all. ## the commander's stunning endorsement. The silence following Sarah's nervous, formalized acknowledgement of Colonel Thompson felt immense, stretching the tension in the room to a near-breaking point. Everyone waited, breaths held, to see what the colonel would do next, perhaps a formal debriefing or a general commendation of Sarah's service. Colonel Thompson maintained his authoritative posture, his gaze moving slowly from Sarah back to my parents. My father, seizing the opportunity to break the ice, gestured around the room. "Colonel, please meet the family. This is my wife, Eleanor, and these are our relatives. And this," Dad said, finally directing the colonel's attention toward my corner, "is our other child, Alex." My heart pounded a sudden, nervous rhythm against my ribs. I had been hoping to remain a ghost in the background, a minor character in the new drama of Sarah's high-ranking visitor. I braced myself for a polite, minimal interaction, a quick handshake and a return to the main event. Colonel Thompson's imposing figure turned fully toward me. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, narrowed slightly as he took me in. For a fleeting moment, I saw a look that seemed to mirror Sarah's earlier dismissiveness, the look of a career military man assessing a civilian who likely didn't understand true sacrifice. My humiliation from moments before flared up again. I offered a tentative, professional nod. Then something remarkable happened. The colonel's stern expression completely dissolved, replaced by a broad, professional smile. A smile of genuine, unambiguous appreciation. He walked directly over to me, bypassing Sarah entirely. "Alex," he said, extending a firm hand. His grip was powerful. "It's genuinely a pleasure to finally meet you in person. We've certainly spent enough time on the phone and email." I was momentarily stunned. "Colonel Thompson, sir?" I managed, my voice slightly shaky with surprise. "The pleasure is all mine." He maintained my handshake for a moment longer than necessary, his focus entirely on me. Then he turned his head slightly, his voice projecting clearly enough for the entire room, including Sarah and her audience by the fireplace, to hear. "Captain Henderson," he stated, his voice now a little louder, drawing everyone's attention. He didn't look at Sarah as he spoke, but addressed the room, effectively making his next words a public decree. "I don't know if your family fully understands the role Alex played in our recent operations. Or perhaps I should say our public relations operations." Sarah, who was still locked in her rigid at-attention stance, seemed to shrink. Her jaw, previously set in military determination, visibly slackened. Colonel Thompson continued, his words unfolding with the precision of a carefully executed military brief. "As you know, the Navy has been working for months on the launch of our new Naval Futures Initiative, a critical project aimed at recruiting top-tier talent and clearly communicating the modern, technological mission of the service to the civilian world." He paused, then directed a proud look at me. "The command engaged an external contractor to develop the entire visual brand, the campaign strategy, and crucially, to rewrite and design the presentation manuals. The problem was that our internal teams, while brilliant at logistics and operations like Captain Henderson here, were, frankly, terrible at translating our mission into language and imagery that resonated with the civilian population." He took a step back, now placing his hand lightly on my shoulder. The gesture was one of camaraderie and professional respect, a stark contrast to Sarah's mocking distance. We needed clarity. We needed impact. We needed a civilian professional who could cut through the jargon and deliver a sharp, compelling message. And that is exactly what Alex delivered. He looked directly at Sarah now, his gaze piercing. "Captain, the new Naval Futures Initiative website, the one you saw go live last week? The manual that is now being used across 3 fleet commands? That entire project was designed, written, and executed by Alex. Their work was critical to ensuring our message was clear, precise, and effective. They translated complex operational realities into understandable, engaging content. The professionalism, the dedication to precision, and the sheer talent required to achieve that result under our tight deadlines were, in my estimation, nothing short of superior." The colonel finished his glowing testimonial, giving my shoulder a final, firm squeeze. "We consider Alex a highly valuable, indispensable part of the wider team, and frankly, we are already hoping to have them on board for Phase 2 next quarter." The silence that followed was absolute, weighted by the sheer shock of the commander's unsolicited, powerful endorsement. The captain who had just dismissed my job as a hobby that pays the bills had just had her superior officer declare that hobby to be of superior quality and indispensable value to the organization she herself served. Hashtag, the crushing silence, and the table turned. The air after Colonel Thompson's declaration was thick enough to choke on. The colonel's words, "nothing short of superior, highly valuable, and indispensable," echoed in the heavy, stunned silence of the dining room. Every head swiveled from the smiling, appreciative colonel and me back to Sarah. Sarah, the decorated officer, the source of all the earlier ridicule, was utterly devastated. The blood had completely drained from her face, leaving her a ghastly white. Her military posture, rigid moments ago, had become frozen not by discipline, but by pure, agonizing mortification. Her lips were parted slightly, but no sound escaped. She couldn't even meet her commanding officer's eye, let alone mine. Her narrative of my job being frivolous filler had not just been challenged. It had been publicly and unequivocally annihilated by the highest authority she respected. My parents, who had watched the entire earlier exchange with growing distress, now looked at me with a new expression. Not pity, but genuine, beaming pride. Aunt Carol and the cousins who had listened to Sarah's mockery now shifted their weight awkwardly, looking everywhere but at Sarah or me. I, too, felt a rush of adrenaline, but I consciously kept my expression neutral. This was not the time for gloating. The vindication was powerful enough without adding insult. I simply met the colonel's eye and offered a sincere, calm thank you. "That means a great deal, Colonel Thompson," I said, keeping my voice level. It was a challenging project, but ultimately very rewarding. "I'm grateful for the trust the command placed in my team's abilities." The colonel nodded, satisfied. He clearly had no idea of the domestic drama he had interrupted and inadvertently resolved. He was simply stating a professional fact. He briefly exchanged pleasantries with my father, confirmed his plan to leave shortly, and reiterated his enthusiasm for our continued professional collaboration. A few minutes later, with a final, crisp nod to my parents and a final, respectful, yet friendly glance in my direction, Colonel Thompson said his goodbyes and departed. As the front door closed, the collective silence in the dining room erupted into a flurry of sudden, loud chatter, an almost desperate attempt by the family to return to normalcy and disperse the concentrated awkwardness that remained. Cousins rushed over, not to ask about the design process, but to congratulate me on my impressive work and the amazing compliment from such a high-ranking official. The shift in attitude was instantaneous and absolute. No one was laughing at the font choices now. I finally looked directly at Sarah. She was still standing near the fireplace, physically unable to move. She met my gaze for a split second, and in her eyes, I saw not just embarrassment, but a crushing self-recognition of her own injustice. She finally detached herself from the wall and approached me, her movements slow and heavy, lacking her usual spring. "Alex?" she began, her voice low and husky, the command stripped away, leaving only a residue of shame. I had no idea you were working on a project of that scale. I thought it was just freelance brochures or something. I waited, letting the silence press down on her. What I said earlier, she stammered, fiddling nervously with the edge of her blazer. It was unprofessional and unfair. I let my ego get the better of me. I apologize. My job is vital, yes, but so is clarity and communication. Thompson's right. We couldn't do what we do without people who can translate it. It was a clumsy, heavily qualified apology, born more out of acute public shame than deep personal remorse, but it was an apology nonetheless, a full admission of her error, forced into the open by her own commander. I simply nodded, accepting the apology without dwelling on it. It's fine, Sarah. We all value different things. The point had been made with devastating finality. The career she had mocked as an insignificant hobby was the exact skill set deemed indispensable by her own highly regarded professional world. Her attempts to define the sole meaning of real work through the lens of military service had backfired spectacularly. For the rest of the evening, Sarah remained subdued, chastened, and unusually quiet. The moral high ground she had occupied for years had vanished, replaced by a tangible, profound respect for my professional contribution. The silly stories and colored pens had won the day, validated not by my own efforts to defend myself, but by the irrefutable public judgment of the one person whose authority Sarah couldn't dare question. The table had been thoroughly, wonderfully turned.